Hello everyone and welcome to the webinar, Setting the Stage for Implementation Success, Intervention Testing, Piloting, and Staging. Let's go ahead and do some introductions. With more than 25 years of public and private sector child welfare experience, Will Hornsby's work has been focused on implementation science principles, systematic problem-solving approaches, and assisting state and local agencies in monitoring their child welfare programs. With more than 30 years of experience working with state child welfare systems, Joan Nelson Phillips is a CQI and practice improvement expert consultant. With 20 years of experience working with public child welfare systems, Simon Pipkin is a leader in organizational capacity building, active implementation support, and systems change. I will now turn it over to our facilitator for the day, Sherry Levesque. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris, and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the event. I'm going to take a few minutes first to go over our agenda for the day, and first we'll be doing an overview quickly of the change and implementation process as a whole. And we'll really be spending the majority of our time today talking about the three main components of the topic: usability testing, pilot testing, and staging and scaling up. Then we'll touch upon some common challenges and potential strategies in this area. And then, as Chris said, we'll spend the last portion of our time in small breakout discussions. And we'll be hearing from our three panelists about their experiences in this area along the way. So briefly, I'll touch upon our objectives as well. We are hoping to identify the essential tasks in these three areas that I've mentioned: usability testing, pilot testing, and staging and scaling up. And then we'll be identifying strategies and activities in these three areas, and also allowing you an opportunity to connect with one another to talk about how to increase your capacity for planning and conducting these tasks as well. So quickly, before we get started, we'd like to just do a really quick poll to gather your responses to this really simple question about whether or not you are willing to allow us to perhaps contact you in the next several months with a follow-up survey about your participation in this event. So while folks are having an opportunity to answer that poll, after the poll, we'll be moving on, as I said, to a quick overview of our implementation process as a whole, and we'll take a look at where our event for today falls in that process. And so folks are still taking a few minutes to just put in their responses to the question. Thanks for that. Appreciate it. And I think we're just about wrapping up. I appreciate folks' willingness to allow us to reconnect with you all in a little bit to continue to improve our support to you. So as I mentioned, we'll be moving now into a quick overview of our process. So Chris, if you want to move ahead to the next slide. Great. And many of you will recognize this graphic. It depicts our implementation process. In fact, some of you may have participated in previous events on some of these topics or seen our briefs or resources on them. You can see in the graphic that the topic for today, intervention, testing, piloting, and staging, is over there in the middle left. And ideally, this activity is happening after an implementation plan has been made. Sometimes the team will have already begun thinking about their testing approach when they are forming their implementation plan. And as with each of the steps in this process, having a diverse team that really represents all of the involved stakeholders and understanding where the organization is in its readiness for change is really critical to successful implementation. So in the brief on this topic, we've organized this into 3 parts that we've just mentioned: usability testing, piloting, and staging and scaling up. And within each of those parts, there are steps or essential functions, as you can see here. Agencies may not always complete all of these steps in every circumstance, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Also, while the steps are presented here in a linear way, in practice, often the steps will overlap and teams might loop back and forth between the steps as they test, pilot, and stage. We also really want to encourage teams who use this brief to guide their work to also reference the brief on monitoring, evaluating, and applying findings in conjunction with that. Since many of the decisions that you'll be making about testing, piloting, and staging are really heavily dependent on evaluation plans and the findings that emerge from evaluation along the way. So let's take a few minutes again. I know we're all about the polls today. Let's take a few minutes to hear about your experiences with testing, piloting, and staging. And we have several polls here to give you an opportunity to share that experience. So the first one you see at the top there that's multiple choice is really about your experience with planning for and implementing pilot testing prior to large-scale implementation of a new intervention. And then we have some questions there as well about challenges or successes that you've encountered in piloting new programs or policies. And also challenges or successes in staging and scaling up those programs or practices. We'll give folks a few minutes to respond there. Like we have a good spread of experience in planning and implementing pilot testing. With a number of folks having some experience with that. A good number of folks having no experience with that at all yet, which is great in the sense that you know, I think the information today will be helpful to folks. And then in terms of challenges and successes in piloting, it's looking like folks are identifying things like, yeah, organizing it all for sure, and multiple initiatives that overlap, which is really the norm, right? We're never doing just one thing at a time in child welfare for sure. Getting diverse partners to the table, especially line workers, really critical, but not always easy to do for sure. Yeah, gathering info along the way related to policy and practice to make adjustments before implementing. Yeah, we're going to talk a fair bit about that today and the importance of it. Project management and communications, absolutely, and this sort of goes back to the earlier comment about organizing it all for sure. And all of this, of course, is related to timelines. Again, a reference to buy-in. Let's scroll down a little bit here. Readiness issues, which is really a good call out. And then looking a little bit at challenges about staging and scaling up when you're getting to really rolling something out on a wider scale. Knowing when the best time to move forward is, that is a really important variable for sure. Yeah, there are some similarities, really, some similarities in the questions about those related to piloting, timing being one of them, absolutely. Sustaining the energy, that's a really great one, and how to best do that. So these are some really great questions and experiences to share. thanks everyone for doing that, and I think that will really be helpful, particularly in two ways. When our panelists talk in a little bit about some of their experiences, I think they'll be touching on exactly some of the questions and challenges you talked about, and also in our breakout sessions, those will be really great topics of conversation for discussion then. So thanks everyone for sharing that. So before we really jump into the meat of the content, let's just take a little bit of a moment to reflect and give you a chance to start thinking about some of the challenges and successes. And some of these that I'm about to mention, I think, will echo some of the ones that you just identified in the poll as well. So for example, and we'll use a concrete example here that probably many of you are familiar with, just to sort of ground this discussion. Most, if not all, agencies have had some experience with implementing a safety model or pieces from a safety model, like assessments or assessment tools, for instance. Using that as an example, one success with both piloting and staging would be that perhaps the agency engaged the right team at the right time. So they really went beyond their internal stakeholders and included other systems that are critical to making decisions about child safety, such as courts. Maybe the agency designed a hybrid approach with the agency and the court, and they really used the pilot phase to determine if both the processes and the tools for the new model work as they were planned to work. On the other hand, a potential challenge that is a real life challenge is that as the staging of the rollout of the safety model happens, there's a heavy emphasis on frontline workers, maybe even just the child protection or investigative staff, and the same level of depth of information or training isn't provided to supervisors or the remaining program workers. And so in this instance, for example, you might see an increased risk of only viewing the work of child safety as a child protection function and not one that's the responsibility of the entire workforce. And therefore, that would potentially impact the success of the implementation. So as we learn more about testing, piloting, and staging today, I'd encourage you to listen and look for concepts and practical strategies that can help you avoid or overcome similar challenges to these. So we're going to spend just a couple minutes really sort of drawing the distinctions between these three different pieces that we're talking about here, particularly first between these two different types of testing, usability testing and pilot testing. While these are similar concepts, usability testing and pilot testing really differ in terms of their focus and their scope. So usability testing is really very intended to be really very quick, targeted, and it's really focused on a specific aspect of an intervention or an implementation process, such as a tool or a form or a procedure. And it's designed to really answer the question about whether that process or tool works in the real world the way that it was intended to work. Does it make sense to the staff who might be using it or the family members that might be involved with it? Is it being used as it was expected to be used? On the other hand, pilot testing is more comprehensive. It's likely a longer process, and essentially it's a test of implementing the entire intervention, or at least major components of it, under carefully selected conditions, like in a specific geographic area or with a specific target population. It's really more than just trying it out with a few workers or on a few cases. And it's really designed to answer questions about whether or not both the implementation is successful and also whether the intervention might be having the short-term outcomes that it's expected to have. And also to tell the team something about what kinds of supports might be needed to make the implementation effective or to be able to replicate it on a larger scale. So when do you do which of these things is really sort of the next question. In an ideal world, implementation science models suggest that you'd move from adapting or designing a new intervention into usability testing and then pilot testing and then staging or scaling up. In reality, this isn't always feasible or the way that teams might choose to proceed. And where teams choose to begin testing or scaling up might depend on a number of different factors, including the purpose of the intervention, what the existing evidence base for the intervention is, and what kind of mandates or timeframes that they're working within that might require a move more quickly to a large-scale launch. So, for example, some considerations for making these decisions are shown here. If an intervention is brand new and doesn't already have a strong evidence base, then usability testing is really the logical place to start. If an intervention is well supported by evidence but is being adapted with a different population or in a different context, then usability testing is still recommended and or pilot testing. If, however, an intervention is also well supported by research evidence and it's being replicated in a fairly similar context or with a similar population, then the agency might consider just pilot testing and then staging or scaling up, or in some cases moving directly into staging the intervention. And in some circumstances, and you might see this, for example, when there are federal, state, or legislative mandates that require it, or there's a perception that there's a fairly low risk of implementing the intervention, or there are very tight timeframes for some reason, those things might prompt the team to decide to move more quickly from identifying the intervention to launching it on a large scale. Even so, it's important to keep in mind that there are some potential trade-offs to this approach, in that it can increase the risk that implementation won't be successful or that the intervention might not be effective in getting the outcomes that were hoped for. So it's important to understand these risks before making decisions about proceeding directly to full launch of an intervention. So we'll dig a little bit into usability testing first, and then we'll have a chance to hear from our panelists about some experiences with that. Usability testing, as we said, allows teams to try out critical intervention components and implementation procedures and see how they work and what the user experiences are with them, particularly sort of concrete things like tools, forms, processes that are being used or adapted for the first time. So there can be refinements made to them if needed before they're used in a pilot or in a rollout. And some of the things teams may want to consider usability testing for are listed on the left column there on your screen. Might be things like assessment practices, for example, things that would be core components of an intervention. Maybe implementation activities like fidelity assessment tools that will be used to determine if an intervention is being implemented as intended. It could be things like implementation support, such as new training models or coaching guidelines. And it could also be things like data collection processes that will occur, for example, data entry forms that will be used to collect data. So creating a plan for the testing helps teams to be intentional about the what, who, how, and when, as you see there, of the testing period, and be able to clearly define roles and responsibilities during the usability test, the data or criteria that will help them decide if the tool or the process will need adapting. And so a usability test can be seen as a plan, do, study, act cycle, in the sense that The testing is planned, as we've just described on the last slide, and then it's conducted. And then the results, of course, are studied using such questions as some of the ones you see here. What were the participants' experiences using the tool or the process? Is it being used as it was expected to be used, and are the results what was expected? Do the feedback and data from participants suggest that it needs to be adjusted? And what resources will be needed to make those adjustments, if so? And lastly, is further testing of that tool or component needed before it's finalized? So I would like to turn it over to our panelists now, and I'll start by turning it over to Will Hornsby to lead us in the discussion. And Will, I'll ask you to start off with if you could talk a little bit about the types of intervention components, tools, or processes that you've seen jurisdictions use usability testing with, and how did the results from that testing help inform their ongoing implementation planning?
Thanks, Sherry. Yeah, I've seen jurisdictions conduct usability testing, better understand eligibility, selection criteria for the recipients of an intervention, looking at the consent process for individuals or families to participate in an intervention, trying to better understand engagement rates of targeted possible recipients, and then as the earlier slide had, looking at new data collection efforts, forms, data gathering approaches that are going to be put in place to both support the implementation of the intervention, but then also gather information about the outcomes. I've seen jurisdictions conduct usability testing on the functionality of new forms, processes, such as a form developed to track key information gathered from a case review to inform the direction of the intervention. Jurisdictions will also conduct usability testing on training and coaching, as was mentioned earlier, but really thinking about how newly developed training and coaching activities are impacting staff that are first applying their learnings with individuals or families that are recipients of the intervention. I have seen results from usability testing efforts confirm a jurisdiction's expectations about how things would proceed, and then embolden them to move forward with their implementation efforts. However, I've also probably more often seen usability testing results, revealing challenges or unexpected barriers that forces a jurisdiction to problem solve, to either amend or alter a tool or process, to revise implementation supports, all with an effort to get better results. And that rapid testing cycle, offers a jurisdiction the opportunity to identify challenges, brainstorm, develop possible solutions, and then quickly test out the new approach in order to move through this usability testing as timely as possible. So with that, I want to ask Joan. Joan, what in your experience been some of the benefits for jurisdictions in taking the time to conduct usability testing?
Okay, thanks, Will. Yeah, I would say the first thing that comes to mind for me is that initiatives or interventions, kind of big or small, that child welfare agencies are engaged in, they come with a lot of moving parts. And in my experience, those kind of key components that are considered by the agency to be the most critical or central to the successful implementation of that initiative are almost always going to be worth, if you can do it, taking the time to first test things out so that you can work out any of the kinks before rolling the entire thing out. And if you think about it, by the time you get to the pilot testing phase, you're essentially implementing your entire intervention, even if it's on a smaller scale, all the moving parts in multiple jurisdictions at the same time. And so at that point, you're not as likely, in the process to be able to spend the amount of time that you're going to want to be able to get those key components fully figured out. And I think a lot of agencies inadvertently skip over this important step in the process. With usability testing, an agency has the opportunity early on in the implementation process to learn from this type of more focused testing on a subset of intervention components versus the broader initiative, and also with a smaller group of users, as opposed to, all of your agency staff or an entire population of service recipients. And a couple of examples I can offer to you today would be, there was an agency that was intending to overhaul their entire statewide CQI model, and they wanted to test out a couple of key components before moving deeper into implementation. One was a new qualitative case record review process, and the other was a new teaming structure. And so what they opted to do was test out the case review process in several regions at the same time, but the teaming structure was more like usability testing. They really tried that one out in only one region because they had some specific issues around the complexities of trying to engage their external stakeholders and trying to improve those partnerships. The other example I would offer today is just an agency that was implementing a new practice model that covered everything, safety through permanency, and where transforming how caseworkers engaged with children, with parents, and caregivers was central to the successful implementation of that model. And so they wanted to test out, as part of that, a new approach to improving the quality of caseworker visits, which we know is pretty common with states. And this, for them, included a combination of doing some new training, having a supervision model, and also putting some coaching in there. And so they were able, through kind of doing usability testing, to really focus on getting the critical components for those three things nailed down and then working in tandem with each other in a couple of counties before moving into piloting the more expansive practice model elsewhere. So my takeaways on that is, in both of these examples, each of those agencies was able to make the necessary and appropriate adjustments to those types of critical components in their change initiatives through this type of testing. And this, in turn, helped them kind of support the success of their broader long-term rollout. So I'm going to throw this last question over to Simon. And the question, Simon, is what are some of the challenges you've seen with jurisdictions in conducting usability testing? And if possible, maybe share some strategies that you've seen in addressing those types of challenges.
Sure. Thanks, Joan. The first thing that comes to my mind in this area is that the term itself of usability testing is a bit foreign to some jurisdictions. In my work, this is an area that has sometimes been skipped or not even considered. Though we do know, and I know from real-world experience, that usability testing has occurred historically and had an impact when jurisdictions were designing, implementing, and improving over time their SACWA systems. So this does tell us that there's some experience there with usability testing, but it really needs to evolve with other implementation projects, which is to say when it comes to practice changes, such as we mentioned earlier. Sherry talked about the safety assessments or safety models. With safety assessment, safety models, I've seen little or no testing of specific tools, assessment, core components, and sometimes even the implementation processes. Most times what we see is that these are all packaged and either tested with the actual pilot sites and or implemented in a stage approach. They just launch it and adjust it over time, which leads to some challenges around when do you stop adjusting for every bit of feedback that you're receiving. Without the testing, whether a tool or activity will achieve what it set out to do, I have seen it have disturbing impacts on several levels, such as workforce, around retention, things like that, systems capacity, and of course, even down to child and family outcomes. So for a more specific example, since we've already talked about safety models, I have seen firsthand some negative impacts that I believe, and so did the jurisdictions that I was working with, in part were attributed to neglecting usability testing. So in a few jurisdictions that I've been involved with that have implemented certain safety models, that does include a comprehensive safety assessment, where a couple of agencies either piloted and went straight to stage rollout. all skipped usability testing. They saw in a short period of time quite a dramatic uptick of children entering care. So much so that this uptick overburdened the system in several areas. One, of course, workload pressures, delays in completing critical casework milestones such as meeting the parents and children in a timely and quality manner, completing assessment reports, and also around safety and case plans. And it also had quite a big impact with our courts. So if you're thinking around across the system of care, this included increased dockets, continuance of hearings, lack of information from the agency to the court, all leading, again, to delays meeting the needs of children and families. Of course, not testing the assessment tool and process, I'll say this is not the ultimate determination of what the main reason for that is, but many folks across those jurisdictions and myself believe it was one of the contributing factors. Now, as for a strategy to overcome, I can say that one of these jurisdictions that had this uptick did go back and test their safety assessment tool, so they did shift backwards a bit. But their focus wasn't just on whether the components of the tool worked. They had quite a bit of evidence from other jurisdictions that this tool was pretty sound and it had some evidence behind it. But more importantly, they tested the users as to their understanding of what the assessment questions were intended to capture. And what they found was that some, or if not all, of the parenting functioning areas of the assessments, they were not fully understood, and this led to many agency workers and supervisors making recommendations to remove. So they went beyond what the allegations of the safety threat were and were digging deeper, not truly understanding those specific questions. So their biggest lesson learned was that in order to pilot and then roll out anything, they must first test to ensure that they develop the right messaging, training, and ongoing support so that everyone that touches whatever it is they're implementing understands the purpose and context. And so with that, I will turn it back to Sherry.
Great, Simon. Thank you. Thank you, and thanks to all of you for sharing your experiences. We're going to move from usability testing now to the more comprehensive pilot testing of interventions. And as teams move into this stage, thinking through their approach to the pilot and their planning for it really can help to identify important parameters for the pilot that will yield enough information to help the team decide on the next steps. So, for example, parameters such as how long the pilot will last or how many sites there will be. One of the first things that teams need to decide is whether they will be conducting a pilot. As noted earlier, in some instances, teams might choose to move directly into staging and scaling up. However, for the reasons that people have been talking about usability testing as well, in most instances, a pilot will be conducted, and teams should develop a clear plan for pilot testing that incorporates the things that you see here on the screen, and really considers things such as the existing research base of the intervention and the implementation history of it. How has it been implemented in other jurisdictions? The agency's experience with implementation of other interventions. So, for example, if an agency has historically had trouble with a certain aspect of implementation, such as maybe engaging community partner support, for instance, then the pilot plan ideally will address perhaps some new engagement approaches to collaborate with partners that will address that. Ideally, the plan will provide for some flexibility in outlining how quick adjustments will be able to be made during the pilot as are needed. And also the plan would address how decisions will be made at the end of the pilot about whether the intervention will be scaled up and spread or not. Also, the pilot plan would address an understanding of the readiness and the capacity of the selected pilot sites to implement, and the plans to build capacity if there's a need to in some or all of the sites. Additionally, strategies to engage site staff and key stakeholders and also how the sites will engage with one another during the pilot to share their successes and their lessons learned. Those should be things that are considered in the plan. And lastly, the anticipation and plan for any potential roadblocks that might be encountered in the pilot. And then, of course, one of the key components of the pilot testing plan is about the identification and recruitment of the pilot sites. So some considerations include, as we've said, the different capacity and readiness of sites, and also how the implementation team will communicate the costs, the benefits, the supports that will be available to the sites, as well as what the expectations are for the sites and potential challenges that might arise during the pilot. So when considering how sites will be identified and recruited, teams really should look at three key areas: the number of sites that will be involved based on the needs of the pilot and the resources that are available, the criteria that will be used to determine which sites will participate, and the process that will be used to select the site. So once the pilot plan is made and the sites are selected, then activities that may occur as teams actually conduct the pilot include some of the things you see in the box on the left there, the development of implementation processes that will be employed in the pilot sites, the development and delivery of data collection tools and procedures for that will be used. Also, the training and coaching models that will be used to introduce the new intervention. Activities might include pre-work and meetings with sites to review the pilot process and collect information about the sites themselves that would impact implementation, and also to introduce the sites to the pilot activities and the support that that will be provided to them. And lastly, the development of communication channels between the sites for them to learn from one another throughout the pilot. And we also really want to call out here that data collection during the pilot is critical to decision making. And teams really should consider collecting both quantitative and qualitative data and ensuring that the measures that they're collecting data on are defined consistently across the different sites so that there's some reliable data being collected. And that the data measures that are being used will provide the information that's needed about what's working and what's not to help inform decisions. This is really where the connection that we mentioned earlier to the evaluation planning process, this is another spot where it's really critical in terms of conducting these activities. All of this is deeply interrelated to that planning as well. So some examples of data that might be collected during the pilot could include things like implementation outputs. So for example, the number of staff that have been trained or the number and types of services that have been provided. Data might be collected about the degree to which the intervention was delivered as intended or fidelity, as we've mentioned. Some data might include feedback from staff or service recipients or other stakeholders about the intervention itself or about the implementation activities and support. A team might also collect data about the effectiveness of the implementation processes and what that means for the ability to scale up the intervention. And lastly, teams might also collect data about the impact of the pilot, hopefully on expected short-term outcomes that have been identified. So as information becomes available from the pilot, based on the data that's been collected or being collected and analyzed, teams should assess the results of both the intervention itself and the implementation process and use the findings from that to inform recommendations about whether to move forward with the intervention on a larger scale, and if so, how. Assessing the results of the pilot should include things like whether sites met the implementation objectives and expectations, what worked, what didn't work, any changes that might need to happen before wide-scale implementation can occur, or additional supports that will be needed for wide-scale implementation, and what benefits or incentives might be leverages to promote ongoing buy-in. In reviewing progress, the implementation team will want to share key findings about the pilot with leadership and decision makers, as well as with staff, service partners, and community members, including youth and families. And teams will also want to review their progress with program developers or other experts who can help the team make any needed changes that will also minimize any risk to the fidelity of the intervention and its effectiveness. And ultimately, decisions about adjustments to the intervention and next steps should include any potential changes to the implementation strategies, adjustments to the intervention components themselves if needed, identifying any program champions that could support further scaling up, or developing or refining the implementation plan for staging and scaling up, or in some cases choosing as a team to stop the intervention and not go further. So let's hear from our panel a little bit now about their experiences with pilot testing. And I'll start off with Simon here. Simon, what in your experience have been some of the benefits for jurisdictions to taking the time to pilot test before moving on to full implementation?
Okay, thanks, Sherry. And forgive me, group, if I sound a bit repetitive to some things Sherry said, but it's important to restate those. So first off, just generally speaking, a pilot is an opportunity to test drive both the intervention and the design implementation process. So this is important because it'll help you catch possibly some potential problems and develop actions to prevent those problems on a larger scale. It can also help determine if any adjustments to your implementation plan or adaptations to the intervention are necessary. But let me go a little deeper and provide a couple more examples or benefits and actually tie it to a specific project that I'm thinking about. One advantage of pilot testing is that it provides an opportunity to gauge your target population's reaction to the intervention or their response to the intervention or program. This includes both, of course, the intended users, such as your workers or supervisors, but also those that are receiving, which, of course, are our parents, children, youth, and other external stakeholders like private providers. Measuring those reactions can help determine how best participants respond and receive any training, coaching, the overall fit of the intervention, and also the adjustments needed to make it successful. So here's an example. In one jurisdiction, they were implementing a practice model, which we all know is no small feat, and they were very diligent and purposeful in designing a pilot phase that included lots of objectives for what they wanted to get out of it. But one purpose of their pilot test was to assess the actual training, the curriculum, and the classroom structure and coaching sessions that were going to be received from by workers and supervisors to measure their reaction again and their response. As a result of data collected through evaluations, surveys, focus groups, it was determined that both the classroom and the curriculum was way too long, and they had identified that certain segments, particularly those that were about theory or concepts, could actually be provided outside of the classroom through self-placed learning resources. So what this resulted in is what they thought was needed was a 5-day training. It cut down to 2.5 days, which still sounds a bit long, but they were able to focus those 2.5 days on skill development and skill demonstration. But another thing that came out of the pilot that was very interesting to them, and one thing I guess they may have skipped over as they were developing their communication strategies, was that the pilot provided both worker and supervisor perceptions of the actual practice model. More specifically, most of the people that were going through the pilot stated that they believed in the model, that it matched their social work values, but the data came back through those focus groups and surveys that said roughly 75% said they were not sure of the motivation and reasoning of state leadership for adopting and implementing a practice model. So that kind of reinforces the top-down approach. So this group, its implementation team and its leaders, they knew that organizational culture and climate is a driver for successful implementation. So the lesson learned was to go back and ensure the implementation process, the portions of the curriculum, and other messaging resources were adapted to ensure that people knew the reasonings for why they were moving to such a big change in their system. The last advantage I'll mention around pilot testing, this ties into evaluation, is it can help you ensure that you are well prepared to measure the success of both implementation and of the intervention. So it can highlight any adjustments that are needed to your evaluation plan, as well as provide an opportunity to pilot any evaluation instruments. The pilot will give the evaluation team and implementation team a better chance to work together before full implementation and troubleshoot any logistical issues that might arise with the distribution and collection of data. Going back to that other jurisdiction, this was absolutely the case. They brought their evaluators were part of a local university, and they brought them in to help facilitate the pilot and to conduct another kind of semi-evaluation of the pilot. And so they conducted, through their evaluation of the pilot, they used the opportunity not only to know how to work with the implementation team, but to test their evaluation instruments that they'd already completed and adjust those as needed before they went to full scale. So with that, I'm going to go to Joan, and now that we've highlighted a couple of benefits, Joan, why do teams choose not to pilot test? What are the challenges?
Yeah, well, I mean, we've been talking about a lot of those. So, I mean, it's an interesting question because I think intuitively in the work that we do, all of you guys on the line today, that it would just seem that pilot testing is so advantageous to a successful implementation that it's hard to understand sometimes where it is skipped over, but we know it does happen. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I'm going to pick out a couple just in my experience. I think it can be the result of sometimes a determination, I would say, based on kind of a shared, commitment by the agency and an investment that they have in a specific intervention. And also sometimes the very genuine belief by agency leadership and their staff, which is a good thing, to simply move, full steam ahead. We're going to develop the intervention. We're going to implement it. And one way or another, we're going to get it to work. And we'll just go ahead and troubleshoot any kind of hiccups along the way. And I think that this is especially true if this is a familiar practice or a way of approaching implementation within an agency. Also, a lot of times, I think this is familiar to a lot of us, is agencies that are under consent decrees or other legislative mandates may not feel that they actually have the luxury of taking the time to pilot their intervention. They might feel pressured to develop their implementation plan pretty quickly and then roll the intervention out agency-wide in pretty short order, again, kind of fixing things as they go along. And there can also be pressures to utilize resources for an intervention while those resources are still kind of quote-unquote available. This is particularly true in situations where there's a sense that there are going to be impending changes coming, maybe in agency leadership or a loss in the champions for that intervention, or sometimes significant budgetary cuts that could be coming and would impact the longer-term implementation of the intervention. I think the challenges in pilot testing often come down to time and other constraints, because to do pilot testing well, and we've been talking about this today, Sherry and Simon have offered some examples, we really need to be able to commit to sticking to a well thought out plan, which is also data and evidence driven. And this means taking the time to really engage our staff and our stakeholders in piloting the intervention and using their feedback to be able to make the kinds of improvements that are needed along the way. And agencies don't always have the necessary data readily available to launch and inform their pilot testing processes. And in these situations, additional time might be needed to further develop their stakeholder relationships and to also make investments in their administrative and qualitative data collection systems. So this is just a couple of things that came to mind on that. I'm going to ask Will now, just as a final question, how can the results from usability and pilot testing be leveraged to help inform a jurisdiction's broader implementation and evaluation plan?
Thanks, Joan. Simply stated, implementation teams should ensure results from usability testing and pilot testing are used to revise the jurisdiction's broader implementation and evaluation plan for the intervention. If usability testing causes changes to selection criteria, key components of the intervention, implementation supports, tools, processes, data collection efforts, then those changes need to be made to the implementation and evaluation plan reflected there to ensure that the changes are thoroughly incorporated into the upcoming implementation and evaluation efforts. Also, these types of revisions to the implementation and evaluation plan should be communicated to leadership, key stakeholders. This demonstrates methodical implementation effort is occurring that's based on actual testing of important aspects of the intervention. Timely sharing this type of information should foster increased confidence and support in the intervention's implementation and evaluation efforts as being described in the plans. So with that, we're going to hand things back over to Sherry.
Great, thanks, Will. Thanks, Simon and Joan, also for your comments about pilot testing. We're going to turn our attention now to the third of the components of this stage of the work, which is developing plans for staging and scaling up. Of course, following any usability or pilot testing, once that's complete, teams will really want to revisit their implementation plan and refine it based on, the results of those testing experiences and their learning from them to prepare for scaling up in a sustainable way that includes a clear understanding of readiness, capacity, the supports, and the data that they'll need to move forward with a large-scale rollout. Teams will need to decide whether to stage the intervention. So, for example, stage it by geographic region or by phase of the intervention, or whether the intervention's ready to go to a full statewide launch right away. And some of the factors to consider when making this decision include some of the things that you see in the green box there on the left, related to the scope and complexity of the intervention. For example, if it's something that's fairly straightforward and kind of concrete, it might be appropriate to move to full statewide right away at this point. If it's things that are more complex, a staging approach would be more appropriate. Other things, for example, might include things like support that's available from the developer of the intervention, for instance, or the agency's available capacity to support a rollout, a full rollout versus a staged rollout at this point. Once one of those approaches is decided upon, however, the plan elements for doing that should include things like the site selection and sequencing of a staged rollout, for instance, or even a full-scale rollout. What will be the order of things? The different organizational processes that will be impacted by the rollout, an outline of the capacities that are available or that will be needed to implement, and the plans for ongoing monitoring and evaluation as rollout occurs. So teams will need to think about scaling their intervention in two ways, horizontally and vertically. So horizontally, in terms of moving the new intervention into additional areas, such as new regions or counties, or perhaps through different program areas in an agency, as well as vertical scaling, which is about introducing the changes at different levels of the organization. So, for example, at the leadership level, at the policy level, shifting supervisory expectations, and new practices for caseworkers. Some of the important factors in choosing which sites to implement in earlier versus later are there on the right-hand side, and there's some similar things that you would consider in terms of selecting pilot sites. There are things like the readiness of various sites and the availability of resources to them, their existing knowledge that they may already have about the new practices that have been piloted, the stability of the leadership in that site, the caseload size that may or may not allow for new practices to be incorporated, and the staff and community buy-in to the new intervention that exists in the various sites. And so thinking about what's necessary for successful scaling up really includes three key areas of activities. The first being support for the implementation at multiple organizational levels. So things like developing or revising policies to reflect or align with the new intervention, recruiting or reassigning staff to perform the new intervention and supporting them with training and coaching, or by introducing practice profiles and performance indicators for the new practice. Modifying data systems to collect relevant data about the intervention, or developing and strengthening partnerships or communication channels for leadership and staff. Really shaping all the aspects of your agency infrastructure to align with and support the new intervention. Secondly, fostering a culture and climate that will be supportive of the intervention. You know, Simon alluded to this a minute ago. Might involve activities such as promoting a shared understanding of the vision and benefits of the intervention, the why are we doing this messaging, securing and fostering leadership commitment and support of the effort, reinforcing how this intervention fits with already existing programs and initiatives. I think someone mentioned this in the earlier poll, so that there's not confusion created for staff about how this new intervention, fits in with the things that they're already committed to, and also ensuring that the intervention seems achievable for those staff who will actually be carrying it out. And then thirdly, really a third critical area are activities that will help sustain the intervention over time. And this involves things like working during the rollout to shift the ownership of the intervention from the intervention team to the sites themselves, so that they'll own it and carry it forward. Building strong relationships with site teams, local leaders, developers, and evaluators. Working to institutionalize the intervention at all levels over time through things like maybe including intervention components in contract requirements, or making changes to the information system, or securing sustainable funding for the intervention, for instance. And then during the staging and scaling process itself, teams will want to make sure that there's routine monitoring and checking in with their identified benchmarks or short-term outcomes. And reviewing data will help the team identify what's working well with the implementation, or any areas that haven't gone quite as planned, or that have presented barriers to the site. And again, there's some parallels here to the monitoring or the evaluating that's done during the pilot as well. So that if the interventions, the teams will want to look at whether the intervention is being implemented as intended, so fidelity, and also at any trends or indicators of success. It's also important to know that, or to remember that jurisdictions may not be able to measure everything, and they may need to make strategic choices about what measurements are a priority. Ideally, though, teams should aim to collect and review data on the things you see here on the list. Things like progress on planned timeframes. Are there any adjustments that are needed to the timeline? Are the expected number of cases being served by the intervention? Things such as consistency across sites. What evidence is there that the intervention is being implemented consistently from site to site? Are you seeing similar patterns of percentages of workers that have been trained, or percentages of cases that have been included, or are you seeing wide variations among the sites in those things, and if so, why? Things like participant and stakeholder feedback, and are the plans for collecting and applying the findings of that feedback working? How is that feedback being used to make improvements. And then, of course, are you seeing some of your intended short-term outcomes? So as mentioned, efforts to review and monitor these benchmarks are deeply connected to the evaluation plan. We'll just make another call out for this again. So teams will really also want to review or may want to review the monitoring, evaluating, and applying findings brief that will shortly be available as well as they're thinking through their plans around really all three of these areas: usability testing, piloting, and staging and scaling up. And so we'll have a chance now to hear from our panelists about this phase of the work. And this time I'll start with Joan and ask you, Joan, about, in your experience, how does a jurisdiction determine whether and when an intervention is ready to move to full implementation? And what are the perils of moving too quickly?
Yeah, thanks, Sherry. I would just say that the primary driver from my experience around this really big decision that agencies need to make should always center on what the data or the evidence is telling you. And this goes back to what we've been talking about today in terms of usability and also pilot testing. And both of those are kind of predicated, and this is not an easy lift, but it's predicated on an agency having both developed and then actually implementing a solid testing plan, where you kind of, because I'm watching kind of that we've had this back and forth that we've been doing the participant chat where Lucinda and Amber have been bringing some really good things to the table. And to do the testing, it's more than asking somebody to try out a tool. You want to have, what are your objectives? What questions do you want to ask? How are you going to measure it? What data are you going to use? So having to be able to have those kind of fleshed out is really important, because that's going to help you be able to analyze the data along the way, and it's going to inform the agency's decision making on whether and when to then move to full implementation. So specifically, does the data suggest that the objectives of the pilot or the usability testing have been met? Even if the answer to that question is yes, are there signals that some revisions or changes to the intervention are still going to be needed in order to be able to fully scale up to an agency-wide implementation? In my experience, another key consideration, and again, Lucinda and Amber are kind of doing a good job in the participant chat, centers on whether or not the agency has that broader capacity, or what we would call readiness, to not only expand to full implementation, but to also support and sustain the intervention over time. And it also helps when the intervention has been expanded enough to figure out, to enough sites or locations and over a long enough period of time through the process of piloting and scaling up, that there's confidence within the agency team in its ability to really throw its full support, all the necessary agency resources around those remaining sites without negatively impacting the ongoing performance of those initial sites as they launch, as the agency moves forward to full implementation. So I'm going to go ahead and ask Will very quickly, how can site readiness impact the scaling up process, and what steps can teams take to support sites who are less ready than others?
Yeah, thanks, Joan. Site readiness is intrinsically connected to the scaling up process, because if a site is less ready to scale up an intervention, then the likelihood of success is diminished. If it's determined that a site is not ready to scale up, then hard decisions need to be made about timelines, concrete capacity building steps, strategies should be put in place to address the area of deficits. We know that doggedly moving forward with implementation efforts when a site is not ready it can really be a waste of time and resources, and demoralizes everyone involved. Sites less ready for implementation can be paired with a site that's already experienced success, so they can benefit from mentoring and support. Intervention champions can work with the site's leadership and staff to build positive energy and understanding about the intervention and encourage steps to strengthen readiness. The implementation team can work with the site to determine what needs to occur to strengthen readiness, such as reallocating resources, increasing implementation support, other concrete steps to address areas of need. The challenges and possible solutions relevant to less ready sites should inform, and these issues should be incorporated into the broader implementation plan to help the organization plan for and address possible similar readiness issues with other sites. So with that, I'm going to ask Simon, how do you effectively engage and communicate with internal and external stakeholders on the progress and results from the testing process and or staging and scaling up?
Great. Thanks, Will. Well, first I'll say is don't wait until this phase of the work to think about communicating strategies or the communication strategies in the intended target audiences. Think back earlier in some of the briefs and possible external events, there's this idea around implementation teams. So you need to be very planful, include key stakeholders as members because they can serve both as your initiative champions and also assist with how to best communicate and who to communicate to progress as you're learning from your testing and piloting. But don't limit stakeholder engagement involvement to just the implementation team. For successful implementation, it takes numerous teams on a variety of levels working together to make this change stick. Think about the type of external community teams that are already in existence in your area or need to be formed. Make sure that you're developing both a communication plan and a teaming plan that provides the linkage necessary that keeps everybody informed and up to date on the good news that's happening with what you're implementing. As for communicating findings and the progress from testing and staging, I'll have to say there's no one-size-fits-all approach. However, sharing those results and lessons learned with stakeholders is necessary for sustainability. First is just be sure that whatever you're communicating, it's prepared in a format and in mediums that stakeholders will be able to easily access and understand. But you also need to know the who that needs to be engaged and communicated with. Beyond your early teaming efforts, as you continue to pilot and then stage, there's a need for additional community members to be informed and stay informed. So thinking back to a jurisdiction or two that I've worked with, there's one process for how they identified the who was through what they called community mapping, which is pretty similar to network mapping, if you've heard of that. This just basically involves taking account and documenting the individuals and organizations within their community or state that have far-reaching influence and can act as change agents. So, but also it's remember, we're just not communicating out and giving updates. This is a two-way street. Yeah, you do want to report out progress and gain support and buy-in, but you also engagement includes that stakeholders can contribute. So this could include like a one-time involvement through surveys or focus groups or ongoing engagement through purposeful committees, boards, or members of planning teams. And lastly, when communicating progress, be sure you know your audience. I've said that a couple times. Find a variety of means to communicate your findings. And I'll just shout out just a few examples that I've seen jurisdictions. I'm sure all of you on this call have experienced these types of communication avenues. The first is create some type of publication that is an ongoing documentation of the journey of implementation. It could not only provide lessons learned and the progress, but it provides a blueprint for as people scale into different areas. Of course, we can use the email. That's a good way to get information out, whether you do listservs of certain constituency groups or individuals and organizations. In-person meetings are a great way to share the good news, whether it's through community forums, brown bag lunches, any type of presentations or conferences. Possibly create a newsletter for the specific intervention or initiative that you're implementing. Know who needs to see that, how to get it out to folks, how often it needs to be. I know that's a resource burden, but it is helpful to know that there's a newsletter people can refer to. You might want to create a website for the initiative or at least a landing page on your website that takes people to the initiative. And then the last two areas, of course, are news releases. Let's get it out to the media, and then also use social media, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, or some that come to mind that you can really get quick blurbs of information out about how things are going. And so with that, I think I'm turning it back over to Sherry.
Great. Thanks, Simon. And I think to wrap us up and send us to the breakouts, we have a final poll here, and we'll use some of this information to jumpstart our discussions in the breakouts. So given all of the information that we've just talked about and in that context, what are some of the mistakes that you've seen, and some folks have mentioned some in the chat along the way, in efforts to conduct usability testing, pilot testing, or staging and scaling up interventions. That's the poll on the left there. And then on the right, what impact did those mistakes have on the implementation effort? So folks want to give that some thought for a minute. I think all of us have probably, similar to some of the things you've heard, we've probably all seen really well-intentioned and in many cases well-researched or evidence-based interventions, really either kind of lose steam or not really lead to change for a variety of reasons. Some of those things are what we're looking to gather here. Right, just looking at some of them, and they're really resonating for me, thinking that what worked with one site will automatically work with another, right, without necessarily taking into account the different context and readiness and supports and stakeholders in the different sites, right? There's a lot of responses that make reference to trying to hurry or moving too quickly or not leaving enough time or all kinds of things in that category. And then some of the results folks are adding here are really, as we said, sort of not the intervention not being successful in the way that was hoped, had to make more changes later. Lots of trust with stakeholders for sure. Yeah. Slower getting to the outcomes, absolutely. Yeah. All right, so while folks are putting their final thoughts in there, I think I will turn it to Chris.
Thank you. We are at the end of our scheduled time, so we will be finishing this webinar shortly. Feel free to contact us using our website, capacity.childwelfare.gov/states. That's capacity.childwelfare.gov/states. You can also contact us by our email address, capacityinfo@icf.com. That's capacityin@icf.com. Or by our phone number, 844-222-0272. Thank you for joining us, and have a great day.